vocational education is one where you have a faster realization of benefit. And we think that this will push poor individuals towards accessing vocational education for two reasons. First, vocational education is generally cheaper than liberal arts education. However, under their model, they pressure people to take up liberal arts education because we view a course in philosophy to be a lot more valuable than taking up vocational education. The sort of inflation that they talk to you about when it comes to this perception that a master's degree is better than a bachelor's degree, when really all you're learning is theory and books. It does not give you any sort of practical skill that can actually function within the market. But when it comes to vocational education, when we remove the sort of stigma that is associated with vocational education being only for the poor, when the state removes all subsidies from education altogether, we've pushed the market towards the service industry, which is what it already is moving towards. We push the poor people into believing that taking up vocational education does not necessarily make you any inferior to an individual who's taken up a bachelor's degree. Now let's go back to Nick before moving on to the concept of social mobility. So first, Nick extensively argued to you how, assuming you can improve financial productivity as a result of your course, which specifically includes vocational education, as a result of things like, if I can become a mechanic tomorrow or a chef within a year and be paid very well, there is then an assumption that the bank will be willing to invest on you because it is beneficial to the bank. Okay. Because then also, for them to argue that the bank will not invest on you because you most likely don't have a definitive outcome insofar as profit, we tell you that profit motive is the most important thing for a poor person. We don't want a poor person to enter into a course that does not necessarily become profitable for them as individuals insofar as financial capacity increases. Second, we told you that the individuals who we primarily benefit are individuals who do it for fun, individuals who study philosophy because they like philosophy, rather than individuals who need this. So if you want to study philosophy and you really like it, well, go ahead and do so. Why should the state subsidize a hobby? Because then we should also subsidize things like watching football matches because I get a lot of fun out of doing it. I get a kick. Sit down. But the biggest problem is that we're recycling money from within the system to only go to the richer individuals. What does that mean? When lawyers get into the system and become rich lawyers, they're essentially benefiting directly from the system, and it's only their children that actually continue to benefit. In other words, individuals who would be more likely to get loans, in other words, the rich people, are now opting for state subsidies and opting out to having to spend on this. You can't discourage this participation of the rich within the system because subsidies are open to everybody. But even then, targeted subsidies don't work because you need to subsidize the full infrastructure of an institution. Last, when we talked to you about the inflation of the perception of degrees, we told you how today a lot of jobs that in the past used to be on the basis of bachelor's degrees require a master's degree and a PhD without any actual increment in the level of skill. In other words, if an individual with a bachelor's degree can do a job, it is a matter of perception. It just becomes a barrier to access because there's a recognition that individuals of lower classes are unable to access this. When we remove the fetishization of education or tertiary education, we allow for individuals who enter into vocational education to receive a significant bigger prioritization. Which lastly brings me to my next stage, which is ultimately the prioritization of short-term goals. When we remove the emphasis from bachelor's education, we create a greater value in vocational education. Why? Because we remove the fetishization of the liberal arts and we value things that are a lot more skill-based. In other words, individuals who come out of vocational schools usually benefit from state subsidies in things like the entrepreneurship industry, or in the industries of entrepreneurship, or essentially technical industries that the state currently chooses to prioritize. For example, agriculture, fishery, or any other service industry like IT. These are industries that the state already heavily subsidizes. The ability of these individuals to enter these industries is better facilitated under vocational education. What does that mean? Usually, vocational schools give you a guaranteed outcome in terms of employment, and therefore, your issue of financing is barely ever a problem. We think that reducing the access of the poor to universities as an outcome of this policy is good, because then only if you really need a degree will you ever go for it. In other words, if you want to be a doctor. But that also means that you will definitely get a bank loan or scholarship because you're actually qualified for it and you'll actually do well. And that we're proud of.
Identified and accepted by the government bench in today's debate is that poor people lack financial security and social mobility. And the solution that they offer is twofold. First of all, they want them either to not get highly paying jobs. They want them to get relatively lowly paying jobs that require certain skills. Or they want them to risk huge levels of debt, personal and that rich people and middle class people can access under the status quo. That was relatively incoherent in this debate. But even if we accepted that that were true, we think there's a second dimension of this debate, which is that they need to justify why it's the case that a poor person who's been failed systematically by the state ought not be able to choose to do a liberal arts degree, although we think they completely mischaracterise what this debate is about. So that gets into the first question. What does the topic actually require them to defend in this debate? Because they want to remove all government subsidies of tertiary and higher education. Here's a hot tip for that team. That includes vocational education. So they're going to take away funding for things like TAFE and technical school, which in general is incredibly expensive, and that's why, in instances of recession, is the thing that private industry is far less likely to do. This isn't a debate about whether or not poor people go into liberal arts and philosophy degrees. It's about whether they go into schools at all. It's about whether or not they do any kind of job that would require a secondary qualification. And those things can be being a plumber in some cases. They can also be being a philosopher, or more importantly, being an accountant or being someone with a professional qualification that can actually get access to a highly paid job. The second thing this debate is not about is like carte blanche subsidies that are incredibly poorly spent and are given to really rich universities like Oxford and Yale. Let's engage with some practical reality. The vast majority of schools that were mentioned in Nick's first speech actually operate like largely off private funding because they have huge endowments and don't require government assistance. The kinds of schools that are most reliant upon government assistance are not the ones that they're trying to characterise in this debate, but are schools that by and large do target the middle and poor classes. So let's move on now that we understand what the debate's about. What is the character of this funding? I've already engaged with the fact that it doesn't go by and large to the schools that they suggest that it does. Let's talk about how the private market is likely to respond to this policy. Because they say, if you are genuinely meritorious, you'll be able to get a bank loan, and therefore you can fund your education in that way. Two problems with that analysis. The first is that even if it's true, presuming the best case scenario for them, many people will not try. Many people will not try hard in high school. Many kids will presume that banks aren't going to lend them that money, or will be afraid of taking on debt. Because presumably when you're a poor person whose family have often lived in huge amounts of debt and are afraid of that outcome, you generally find the concept of taking on huge personal debt quite confronting and something you're unlikely to pursue even in the event you would get it. But secondarily, and far more importantly, there are a number of structural reasons why even if you are a very meritorious candidate, banks may still not lend to you, or may lend to you at exorbitant and incredibly problematic rates. Let's engage with the fact that plenty of things might prevent you from getting a job, even if you're very, very good. Like racism, like sexism, and like a number of endemic problems in terms of hiring. So the suggestion that just because you get a good score in a high school, you will always get a bank loan, or you'll be capable of taking on that bank loan is not necessarily true. If you're somebody who comes from a minority neighbourhood, whose family has no history of education, who's never achieved success in terms of jobs like being a lawyer or any of those things, then we think you are necessarily a riskier investment for a bank than some really average kid whose family does have a history of success in those instances. We think the banks are insufficient in this case. Even if they do lend to you, we think it's going to be incredibly exorbitant rates. We think that finally, and most importantly, you ought not be responsible for taking on full debt with regards to your education, because there is a huge social benefit from you achieving this education, which I'm going to get to in 1 second. But before I do that, let me finally answer the question whether or not this restricts choice. Because the suggestion the government mentioned in this debate is somehow government funding for higher education pushes people into higher education who wouldn't normally take it up. It takes people away from jobs where they're earning money and pushes them into higher education. First of all, as we already pointed out, they've ignored the vocational education as part of this debate. But secondly, there's a huge countervailing pressure that balances against that. Because if you're a poor person, obviously your number one aim is, as they said, making money. So many poor people, even where they can go to university, even when government subsidy is available, would choose not to take up government subsidy if they genuinely don't perceive that they're going to be successful in that university, and instead go and get a job immediately when they leave high school and start earning from age 18. So the people who defer that earning are people who presume, or like we presume, and people who presumably are, more likely to be successful in the education system and more likely to get a job as a result of that. So we think that countervailing pressure prevents every single person going into higher education unnecessarily. We think that the people who go are the people who are most likely to be successful. That's a good self-selection mechanism. But ultimately, what they need to engage with in this debate is that there is a restriction of choice in their world. A restriction of choice that says poor people, in the vast majority of circumstances, will not be able to get access to this higher education. Or only a very select few who are incredibly meritorious and who have managed to rise above the situation that they find themselves in will get access to higher education, which we think is a fundamental failing. Yes, Nicholas?
If it's a good idea for them to try and pursue that, why would banks be willing to be in sorts of arrangements which say, we will agree to a contract that will take a certain portion of your income?
Okay, we think that is incredibly predatory. Let's engage with why. your likely income in the future. There's a huge information asymmetry, such that the bank is more likely to have an understanding of the amount of money you're going to earn, more likely to therefore be able to require more money than would actually be reasonable. You as the individual who wants to go to university and has literally no other option because government won't fund it, probably has to sign on to whatever conditions the bank offers to you, which we think is incredibly unacceptable, especially in a world in which the government is complicit for your poverty in the first place, because it failed to fix structural issues that condemned you to that situation where you had to rely upon that loan. You've never engaged with that. So what do I want to talk to you about? Why is there a huge social value in higher education, regardless of the earning potential of individuals, that therefore legitimises government spending on it? The first is social cohesion and understanding. They followed this off by saying, you can create social cohesion at a football match. Ridiculous. The environment is completely different. The environment of higher education is one where you teach people to understand one another. It's one where you actually have a dialogue with people about important issues that go on in the world, as opposed to one which you can occasionally walk past those people on the street, which is essentially the world they propose. Secondly, because we think it's a fundamental part of a good and developed democracy, because it allows people to understand complex issues. It teaches people to question authority. It allows individuals to better express their own preferences and better conceptualize their own preferences. We think that's an important benefit that society as a whole gets from having a more educated population, regardless of the individual economic benefit to the person who gets that education. Finally, we think it makes your economy more successful on the whole to have a high level of education. Because even if it's true that you get inflation of requirements for scores, it is also true that you attract huge levels of businesses to invest in your economy because they know that you have a hugely educated workforce. That's something that's beneficial for everyone in society, not the person who exclusively gets access to the education. This was the fundamental fallacy in the government team's case. They say the only person who benefits from higher education is you, so you should bear the cost. The reality is everyone benefits from your higher education. Government was complicit in condemning you to poverty in the first place. They should pay for it. We oppose.
Generically, an educated workforce is just better because, well, education is good. We don't think all forms of education are necessary for every single person in our country. There are sections of our country that should engage in tertiary education. There are sections of our country that don't need it. And we don't need to have the social pressure or the fetishization that forces these individuals to go into a degree or to go into tertiary education when they can still be financially mobile, when they can still have full careers without it. We think the social pressure that pushes individuals into that is problematic, especially for the sections of society that necessarily don't need. At the end of the day, this debate then is what is best for poor people. One, we're going to talk about why specialized degrees are not good for everybody. Two, why the state endorsement of over-education hurts poor people more specifically. And lastly, we're going to talk about can they achieve it if they really want to, and all the other things that came out in Jeremy's speech. So let's talk about what is best for poor people when it comes to specialized degrees. Look, yes, when it comes to choosing investment banking and law and medicine and all of these professional industries, tertiary degrees are necessary. But not everyone can get there. Jobs at the end of the day come with a combination of a degree and social capital. Your ability to be rich, to be networking, to get the right positions, the right internships, the right connections. That means that the rich people are still going to get your jobs first, even within those sectors. That means your average poor person that graduates with a law degree is still disadvantaged within the law sector and isn't going to get the same kinds of benefits that your average rich person can. But social pressure today currently pushes people towards degrees already, right? What subsidies do is to further decrease the incentive to weigh the personal cost against your long-term guaranteed beneficial outcomes. As an individual, to track what degree you're taking, what job market looks like for you, and the likelihood of success. What subsidies do is to significantly reduce the burden of a loan, the burden of a personal cost, which then fetishizes more benefit than harm when you can't guarantee the kind of benefit that comes out of your degree beyond just, well, society thinks there's a job for you. We think that specialized degrees are not good for most people, and the likelihood of
So if you're a poor person and you know that you need this degree and that's the only best way in which you can achieve meaningful life and contribute to society, you have to prove above and beyond what's the necessary standard just because you are poor, because banks and corporations would never trust you to be able to make money for them just because you're poor.
Why? That never was explained, right? If you can get a space in a university, but if you can get a space in university based on merit, right? You pass all the criteria and you've proven yourself as credible, or proven yourself to have a place in university. Why have you then not proven yourself as being able to be profitable or being able to earn money for a company? We think that if you take your own standards in Andre's speech, that individual has already proven themselves by getting a place in university. Those same credibility will get you the corporate scholarships, will give you all the meritorious standards that exist in the school. We don't see why society will disadvantage you when you have already proven yourself on that front. But we think over-education is actually a problem in society, right? In a saturated market of bachelor's degree holders in one particular industry, you're incentivized them to get a master's degree just in order to be one step up over everyone else in your industry. Here's the deal. More education isn't necessarily a real benefit. Things like masters or PhDs make you far more specialized into an industry. There's no specific real benefit in the practical world to getting a master's or a doctorate, right? It's far too specialized. Your skills become less and less transferable with each extra degree you get. We think poor people just cannot afford to spend another 2 years doing a meaningless degree that adds no benefit to their job market beyond the title of I am now a master's holder. We think that means that especially after being systematically disadvantaged, the social pressure to add in a degree into your name just means that these individuals go into a university for 2 to 3 years and come up with literally nothing at the end of it beyond just a piece of paper, because their skills become less transferable and they become less useful to society. For the average rich person, that doesn't make a difference, because 2 to 3 years in a university with no benefit whatsoever changes nothing for their pockets and they can still do it. For the poor person, that's 2 to 3 years worth of salary that they don't get, 2 to 3 years worth of income that they don't get to have. We think even if it is a lower income because they're not a master's holder, we think that's far more important to them as an individual than it is to your average rich person who can get multiple degrees. What do we want then on our side? Obviously, we're not saying let the poor person suffer and do whatever the hell they want. Obviously, we want the encouragement of innovation and entrepreneurship, putting more money into creative solutions for them. The encouragement of non-traditional models for education. Go learn what you need to learn in any other form of creative way. The traditional form of degrees actually stifles the kind of creativity and innovation and entrepreneurship that these people can come up with. We're happy to spend some amount of the extra money in terms of proving that these individuals can come up with alternate solutions that don't have to fit into the social mold and the social pressure that says you have to get a degree in order to be successful. Because what then happens is a large section of society that don't get degrees just get disadvantaged because of it. Because society and the state endorses that you're only valuable to the economy and you're only valuable to our country if you get a degree. That is why the answer of an educated workforce is good for our economy, or an educated workforce makes you a critical thinker, is a bad message to send to society. Because when you have a section of society that just cannot get to university, you tell these very individuals that they are second class or that they're lower in value because they don't have the same values as the rest of society, compared to the possibility that they could be innovative, they could be entrepreneurial, and they could be valuable to the country in another way. But can we achieve it? And this is where we have numerous ideals from Gemma, right? The first is, well, you motivate these students to stop working in high schools. They have no incentive to do any better. But that exists now, right? The reason why they feel like they have no incentive, they don't want to do any better, is because they don't think they can do anything beyond going to university. What you want to do is encourage them to think of other things beyond university to be fruitful in life, to do more things than just your traditional forms of education. We think that's far better under our paradigm when you don't force them to think that university is the only way they can get any value from life. But the second thing was, well, there are structural deficiencies like racism and sexism that exist in society. Exactly. That's exactly why in society we shouldn't be perpetuating the potential that the only way you can get there is degrees, because you can't get there with just degrees, because there are other barriers that need to be broken first, and those barriers need to be dealt with more systematically. Lastly, this concept of, well, banks are predatory or they don't want to do this. One, people already do this with the state. It's called tax. We already have a government that's predatory in wanting to get the kind of money that they can from you. But two, competition between banks does need proposal or better options